Ace Combat 7 is coming to Nintendo Switch. I really want to emphasize this point because I remember when Ace Combat 7 first came out in 2018 on the other platforms, right? The irrelevant platforms, right? I remember people saying that, like, oh, Ace Combat 7 can't run on Switch, Tekken 7 can't run on Switch, Persona 5 can't run on Switch, Arkham Knight can't run on Switch. And over the past several years, that's been proven over and over again to not be true. And honestly, in the case of a lot of these games, especially like ones like Tekken 7, you really have to wonder why it was a narrative that was pushed to begin with. And looking at Ace Combat 7 coming out in July, you have this sense of, okay, what? First of all, Switch 2 is 100% not coming this year, okay? Like, if they were releasing a port of Ace Combat 7 on Nintendo consoles, like, why not just wait until, like, the next Nintendo console to do it, right? Instead of just porting it on Switch, right? More and more, as the month goes on, we're seeing more and more games get low-key confirmed for later in the year for Nintendo Switch. Major releases. And I know people are trying to, like, brush this stuff under the rug, but it can't. It's becoming more and more clear that the narrative isn't matching up with reality. Okay, Nintendo doesn't need to put out super powerful new hardware to run all of these irrelevant third-party games. And Ace Combat 7 is irrelevant, right? There was a really big marketing period where people were trying to say it was like the best flight game sim ever made or something, but like in reality the game had a troubled production. It's a mess. People don't think it's great. People still prefer Ace Combat 4, right? Like it's not some spectacular masterpiece. Oh, by the way, I have played the game. I played it on Xbox Game Pass, so I am familiar with Ace Combat 7 to a certain extent. I didn't beat it, but I got bored and stopped, right? But again, this was one of those games that people were using to try and downplay the Switch in the 2018 period. This was one of those games that people would try to tell you would never, ever, ever come to the platform. And considering its lack of real relevancy, considering how it quickly came to the Nintendo Switch in like 5 years, considering like the situation in regards to this game, like why even own another console? Like why not just wait until it releases on Nintendo Switch if you're interested in playing it, right? The narrative that, like, Nintendo straight up cannot run these games has been demonstrated over and over and over again to not be true. And people are still refusing to see that. Review Tech USA, like, he can toot all he wants about how, like, oh, it's black magic that Doom Eternal runs on Nintendo Switch. But in reality, of course it can, right? There's nothing wrong with Nintendo hardware. There isn't some magical problem that's making developers completely incapable of developing on Nintendo consoles, right? Like, what's actually happening is that Sony is money-hatting these companies to not release on Nintendo Switch. And this isn't me being conspiratorial. Harada from Tekken has like straight up said this, that he's concerned about releasing Tekken on Nintendo Switch would compromise his business relationship with Sony. We know this is what's happening, right? Like, this is the core problem. This is why Squaresoft completely abandoned Nintendo in the 90s, because Sony paid them to make Final Fantasy VII exclusive, and what ended up happening over the past 25 years is doing that completely tanked the brand. All the talent has left. All they do is chase trends. They don't know how to produce anything of value anymore. And now they've reached the point where they're ruining their own brand, right? Established brands, like Final Fantasy VII, I think, is the big one. And that's been the case for a long time, but until just recently, nobody wanted to admit it was true, because the narrative for the past 25 years is that Squaresoft leaving Nintendo for Sony was a good thing for them. that the games were completely uncensored and that they were edgier and that they were better, that they could do things they wouldn't be able to do on Nintendo hardware. But in reality, it was a step down in quality, noticeably. And that was really obvious to anybody who actually played the games. But the issue consistently has been that people don't play these games. And as a result, you can't adequately compare them. And as a result, you can't come to the actually pretty obvious conclusion that Nintendo is actually superior to these companies, that they do have better hardware, that they do have better games, that they do have better online services, that they do have better digital storefronts, that they do have treat their employees better, that Nintendo is objectively better in every way, shape, and form. They have more variety in their IPs, right? Like, the narrative consistently has been that Nintendo is the bad guy in the industry, but the reality is Nintendo is the good guy in the industry. What you're doing when you're going along with narratives like, oh, Switch can't run that. Actually, Nintendo consoles in general can't run that. Is that you're going along with pro-Sony propaganda. Because without that specific narrative, without the narrative that, like, Switch is for kids or that these games don't have technical depth, like, without that narrative, Sony and Microsoft have no legs to stand on. Like, they cannot remain competitive. If Nintendo was actively getting Grand Theft Auto and Call of Duty with every major release, the other consoles wouldn't have anything, like, over them. Like, that's the only reason other people are buying these platforms, is just for their cap-killing simulators, right? It's just for their global homo simulators, right? Like, it's just for these cheap, disposable third-party games that people gaslight you into thinking are good, when in reality, they're very unimpressive, very generic, very uninspired, and get worse with every new entry, right? These games cannot compete with what Nintendo is doing from an actual enthusiast perspective, right? And that has been the problem for the past 25 years, though, is that the vast majority of people are not enthusiasts. And that's fine. Nobody should, like, strive to be a hardcore gamer. If it's not your thing, it's not your thing. But, like, if it's not your thing, neither should you be having opinions on what the best games are and who the best developers are, and especially who the best hardware manufacturers are. Right? Like, it's crazy to me that people seriously argue about which is better, Xbox and PlayStation, when in reality, they're all functionally the same, right? It's crazy that people think PC gaming is better, considering just, like, the period of time in which you have to wait in between major releases, right? It's crazy to me that people downplay Nintendo the way they do when they've been killing it this generation, right? Like, right now, I'm seeing this weird narrative where people are trying to call Zelda niche, despite selling, like, 20 million units. Like, it's probably just behind Hogwarts Legacy as one of the best-selling games of 2023. And Hogwarts Legacy only sold as well as it did because of the license, you know? Like, I guarantee you that Hogwarts Legacy 2 isn't going to sell nearly as much, like, just because the novelty has worn out, right? Like Lego Harry Potter didn't stay relevant, right? So, I think we're in this position where I've been talking about this for a while. I talked about this last night when I was talking about, like, Angry Joe and, like, what's been happening with that. Like, I think we're in a position where gamers are becoming overly reliant on third-party licensed games to justify their enthusiasm for Xbox and PlayStation. Like, it's crazy when you look at what's going on with, when you look at, like, Angry Joe's top 10 list and you see that, like, 7 out of 10 games on this list are licensed. You know, you have Marvel products on there, you have Harry Potter on there, you have D&D on there, you have Warhammer on there twice. Like, when you see so many, like, licensed products and not, like, actual gaming franchises that have actually evolved and, like, done new things over the decades, you know that you have a problem, because it feels more and more like casual gamers are just going for, like, brands they recognize. Like, oh, man, Spider-Man. I remember when I saw that movie in 2002, like, that's the mindset these people are in, right? Like, it's weird to see, like, Angry Joe pretend that Spider-Man 2 on PS5 is some spectacular Spider-Man game, when I will tell you that, like, you know, the N64 one was better, the GameCube one was probably better. Like there's been years and years of good Spider-Man games, but I doubt Joe has played any of them. You know, like, I doubt he has any experience with that stuff. You know, like, I doubt he has any knowledge of them or cares about them at all, because at his core, he is a poser, right? And that is the issue when we deal with these people, when we interact with them, when we talk about them, when we try to argue with them about these points, when we talk about, you know, how Ace Combat 7 isn't all that impressive and that it could run on Switch, right? When we talk about, like, I've been saying this for years, like, when we talk about how Persona 5 could run on Switch, like, they just refuse to admit it because that goes against their programming. This idea that, like, Nintendo doesn't get these third-party games because the technology is inferior, right? They don't think about the business deals. They don't think about, like, the propaganda. They don't like, they want to believe, they genuinely want to believe that Nintendo is evil and that they support games like Ace Combat 7 not coming to Switch. Games like Persona 5 not coming to Switch. You know, like, I know Video Game Lover 58 got upset when Persona 5 Royal got announced for Switch, right? I know he tried to celebrate when, like, Scramble sold more on PlayStation. Like, never mind that, like, Scramble was a sequel to a game that never released on Nintendo consoles, right? You know, I know these people are desperately hate Nintendo and desperately want to see them fail, and it just isn't working, man. Like, the narrative is crumbling all the time. You know, like, you can prop up like The Witcher 3 all you want, you're never getting a sequel. You can prop up, like, Cyberpunk 2077 all you want, never getting a sequel. Like, you can pretend the game has been fixed, it's never going to happen, right? Like, the reality is simply that Nintendo releases better games more often, and I am very, very sick of people like Angry Joe trying to pretend that that is not the case.